We're going to go ahead and start our artist talk. Okay, so this is, if anyone who's been to an artist talk with us before knows I usually run these a little casual. They're more just discussions with the artists, and they just sort of play by ear. I usually don't even have any notes. But this time I've got 3 artists, so I felt like I needed to be a little more structured with how we do this for the sake of time, so that we're not here for 4 hours just doing artist talk. So what I did is I asked each one of the artists to give me 2 things they'd like to know about the other artists. And I'm going to use those as seeds for questions. And then that should hopefully keep us on task and going pretty quickly. I'm hoping this is about 25 minutes or so. That way everybody has time to ask questions on their own and really get to chat with the artists individually. So let me start at the beginning. My name is Troy Campa. I am the gallery director for Camiba Gallery, and this is our show. It's called Discards, Vessels, and Fragments. It's a 3-person show, and these are our 3 artists. You guys can be a little closer to me. This way don't be scared. I'll make it easier for David, so I don't look like I'm off by myself. So Rebecca Rothfus Harrell is the farthest to the right. Rebecca has been showing with us since we started in 2014. So she's had several solo shows with us as well as a few group shows. Rebecca has a BFA from the School of Art from Institute of Chicago, yeah, and a Master's of Arts in Teaching from Tufts University. And then in the middle is Jason Webb. This is the first time Jason's been shown in the gallery. He's an Austin-based artist, and he has a BFA from Jacksonville University. Is that right? Okay, got it. And then Benjamin McVey. And this is also Benjamin's first time showing with the gallery. And Benjamin has a BFA from Texas State University and an MFA from UT San Antonio. Okay, great. So those are the details. What I'd like to do is kind of just summarize with each one of the artists and ask questions. So Rebecca's work, she's had several different series that she's done over the years. This current series has to do with signs, and she's using that as her subject matter, but she's using it to talk about society and the changes in society and the things that we take for granted as we drive by every day. Did I summarize that right?
Perfect.
Okay, great.
Yes.
Do you want to add to that anything that is motivational for you about this series or the
I guess I told someone this, but driving here, we drove by the one sign that kind of kicked off this whole series, which is right where APD headquarters is, right at I-35. And just took a snapshot, still empty, still the skeleton of a sign. And that was 2014 when I first took the photo of it. So these empty signs, sort of a transition between something, what it was and what it will be.
That leads right into my question.
Oh my God.
So one of the questions that we had is, do you seek out the signs or do they just pop out in front of you and then you're like, oh, here's a sign? Are you driving down the road looking for signs that are empty? Or
I have to give credit to my lovely husband, Clayton. He often says, should I pull over? And I say yes, and he's, do you want me to go around? Should I exit again and then go around? So there are certain ones, I think he knows now, like if it's just a box, it's not a big deal. But if it has curves or a weird configuration, like, no, we gotta pull over. And there are some that I've encountered over and over because of trips we take in the car. And then other ones where I will drive somewhere and make a note, a weird notebook in my car that makes no sense to me now. It's like, exit this by San Antonio. And so there are a few that I've noted and then come back to. But usually I just happenstance encounter them and take a picture and then save it for whenever.
And then do you just have an inventory of them, and when you're starting to create another painting, you're just like, oh, what am I interested in doing?
Yeah.
Is that kind of how it goes?
Yeah. And they've become more because I've gotten pickier to a certain degree, they're not more unique. There are similarities, but there are certain ones I haven't used that I'm sure you know this. We've talked about this in your work, where you're like, I don't know if I can do that one. A Carl's Jr. empty sign. It's so recognizable. It has that star. I'm like,
it's too.
I don't know if I can.
Too iconic.
Yes. So I have a lovely photo that's sitting there and not being painted yet. It's too nerve-wracking. I don't know what that looks like.
So one of the other questions we had was a lot of your work, not just in this series but past works, have dealt with architecture and structures and the built environment. And then even when you were doing your gemstones or your rocks series, that they were put together in sort of an architectural way. Do you know where that's coming from? What that structure, that interest in structure is?
So I was in a show in Columbus, I think, at some point that was about infrastructure when I did my cell tower pieces.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's the first time that phrase and that, like, oh, yes, I'm into that. I grew up in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, which has bridges and all kinds of railroads, tons of infrastructure, that steel mills that were just interesting or part of my surroundings. And then I went to school in Chicago and rode the train every day, and just kind of seeing the water towers on top of the buildings. And I lived very close to the train at one point, like, it's going by. So I think that living in those two places kind of pushed me in that direction. And then I moved to Austin, and the skies were so big, and suddenly you could see all these things, and so Austin played into it, reinforcing it in a way that it's just big open spaces, and then I noticed these towers or signs or things that people just don't seem to know.
Right, they just keep on driving by.
Yeah.
Well, and it's been there since 2014.
I know, everyone should go by today. I have a photo.
I know that sign.
Yes, and once you see it, you can't unsee it,
Right.
because why has this not been used for advertising space?
Great. Well, we're going to move to Jason. Jason, your work is, you're going to have to expand on this, but it's really, one of the words that you used that I thought was interesting was found assemblages. And so they're discarded, they're heavy trash piles, right? When people set things out on their curb and you drive around and you're like, that pile, that's the pile I want to draw. And you take a photo of it and you go back and you draw. But you call them found assemblages. Can you expand on that? I think that's really fascinating.
I think, yeah, the first one that I ever saw reminded me of a Rauschenberg sculpture. So, and he does a lot of assemblage artwork with just seemingly random objects. Like he has one with a goat with a tire around its waist and a bunch of paint on it. And so when I saw the first trash pile that I thought I wanted to do a painting of, I just thought, that's already looks like a Rauschenberg. It looks like found art, basically.
And then, so one of the questions was, how did you make that leap into drawing the discard piles? Because you were doing abandoned buildings before that, and you've also done a series of collections of objects as well.
That's right, yeah. Before this series, I was doing sort of expansive interior views of abandoned buildings, so I was already kind of in the same ballpark of disused, abandoned, decaying spaces. And I think sometimes I would get really interested, instead of the expansive view, in some, vignette of objects that was left behind in those spaces. Never did any paintings of them, and then when I saw these, they clicked for that purpose. Yeah.
So do you consider these portraits? Or are they interpretations? I mean, they're pretty right on with what's really there, right?
Exactly. Yeah. So I don't rearrange them at all. They're exactly as I find them on the curb on bulk collection day. Take photographs of them and just paint them exactly as they are. And I think, in terms of portraiture, I do think a good portrait gives a sense of identity of its subject. And I do think of these as giving some slice of an identity of a household, you know?
Mm.
Like each one belonged to a household at some point and gives you a sense of who they were and what they valued and what they find obsolete in their lives.
Mm.
And so portraiture is a good way to think of it.
Okay.
Yeah.
So you're not necessarily making a statement about the environment or about trash, or you're really doing more of a portrait of somebody's leftovers? Or is it both?
I think, yeah, the environmental factor definitely comes into play. Most of the time, I'm just searching for that gem of a next pile that's going to be like the subject, and I'm loving the formal qualities, the colors, the shapes, the lines. But at some point in the process, when you're driving around for hours on end, staring at huge mounds of trash that's about to go to the landfill, you can't help but get overwhelmed by like how disturbing it is that all this stuff is going to be in the ground for millions of years. Yeah. Right. Yeah.
And so back to the question I asked Rebecca is so do you go out searching for these things, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So there's a schedule, and it's only certain days in certain neighborhoods. So I usually go out once a week for 2 to 3 hours. Yeah. I prefer overcast days because it lines up much better with the white environment. But sometimes sunny days too.
Because you get rid of the shadow mostly, right?
So sometimes it's sort of discordant between the environment of this white void and the shadows that are coming from the sun or whatever, but I include all the realistic internal lighting.
It's just like everything outside.
Everything, the curb, the grass. I don't want to waste my time. Grass blades.
Okay, awesome. Well, I'm gonna move on to Benjamin. Benjamin also has a series, several different series of works. The work that I knew you from doing before this was really was more geometric abstraction, or there was a little realism in it, but it was
more minimal
minimalist
material.
Yeah.
Especially materials that you find at home stores like Home Depot and Lowe's. So it's kind of about the departure from the art store and finding materials in kind of the work world. You know, like when you build a building, what the materials you use to build that structure.
And kind of composition as well, like kind of how that's put together, sort of.
It was built around the idea of architecture. So, yeah. Earlier on, I started off as an architectural model, and then I started working with materials because of that.
And so this series is really new.
Yes.
And it's about finding a quiet space.
Yes, it is. Actually, I was talking to Jason, and I had a little revelation of like, I'm taking something that's very like a complicated subject. It's glass. It's a lot of reflection. There's a lot of things happening with glass, especially as glass overlaps glass, and I'm simplifying it. I'm putting it into this simple space where you can kind of rest in, and you can kind of move in and out of. The glass kind of lets you do that because of the objects in between and out in the background. So it's finding something that's complicated and it's simplifying. And also there's no shadows as well, like Jason.
And so you find the process of painting these as meditative or peaceful, or is it stressful, right?
Well, when I first started doing them, I was trying to do them within one sitting. So I was trying to really divorce myself from being too married to him and too intense about it. I'm trying to make it too perfect. Because I have a tendency, if you look at my older work, the geometrical work, it's very perfect. And that became kind of like, that's the kind of thing I have. It's the thing I know I have. So when I first started painting these, I was like, I'm just going to do these as quick as possible and just not think about it too much, just go with my gut. And but as a lot of things that I do, as I start to do them, I start to try to perfect them. And so they do become more complicated, they become longer paintings. But I do kind of lose myself in them though, because they become like little puzzles.
Right.
So I'm not looking at them so much overall when I'm painting them, I'm looking at them in little pieces and connecting them as little puzzle pieces to create. And then I back up and I see a picture, and then I can come back into it and start adjusting things.
And talk about the decision to not include shadows.
Well, when I first started painting, there's a lot of figurative work, and I started painting in New York at the Art Students League, and also did a National Academy. And it was a lot of this figures against kind of. I noticed I was doing a lot of figures against kind of these flat backgrounds. This is something I was really interested in. I think I have a graphic design background, and I think it was coming out of that. I just really enjoy that very graphic, very that contrast of foreground and background.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think that's kind of a little bit of that still within me. But also I found that the shadows just created another object that I had to deal with, and I really wanted things to be simple. And I also found as I painted it, and I wasn't including the shadows at first. I realized I wasn't doing it at first. I was like, oh wow, and then I started purposely not including the shadows, and it just seemed to, like, even when I showed it to people, they didn't realize there was no shadows.
Mm-hmm.
They're like, oh. And that to me felt like, then it's complete. I made the right choice. I didn't need to add these extra objects. Because they really do become objects.
Yeah.
So, and I really love, and again, I wanted just objects to be objects and live in the space and not having kind of baggage, not having things like shadows.
Yeah, I mean, I think just like with Jason's, I feel like the absence of all of this around it and the absence of the shadows works with the composition, right? It's probably not a decision I would have made because I would goof it all up. I'm not an artist, but it does. It allows you to focus on the object that you've got and not focus on what's around it. The same thing here. It allows you to focus on this and not the grass, the blades of grass or whatever, right? Your works, you're actually placing these on a shelf, right?
Yeah,
and drawing from real life.
Yeah, these are all from life. I'm sitting in front of these objects every day and painting from them. They're not photographs or anything.
So what goes into the decision of how these get placed on the shelf and which pieces you pick? Like, if you just at a junk store and you're like, oh, that glass, I need that.
Well, when I first started, it was objects I actually had in my own kitchen. But I didn't want to like keep painting the same objects, and so I actually started hitting up friends, and I started borrowing things from people I know. And then I also started going to some thrift stores, and I would find interesting like glass objects, vessels, that I thought would be interesting to paint with. And I didn't want to paint something so plain, like, or recognizable, like a beer bottle or something. Though early on I did kind of wine bottles and stuff. But I moved out of there. I wanted to find something that had more life to them and more personality. And so I'd go and kind of hunt for these objects I felt like maybe because I needed that too, like to paint. Like if I was painting something that was just like a beer bottle, I'd be so bored. So I wanted things that interested me and like provoked me, And so I would sometimes I go and hunt for these, and also but they're simple though. They're not too complicated. I think the most complicated one I have is like probably this one,
right?
Or there's a kind of like a wine glass, that orange one. And it has these indentions on it, which I love doing because it was really just a little hint of the brush, and it created this volume just by something so simple, which I really love too. So I'm looking for simplicity, but things I can just like hit, and all of a sudden it's alive.
Creates it,
Yeah.
I'm going to circle back to Rebecca because that brings up another question I had for you about your works and about, do you ever include multiple signs in one piece?
I would just like to give a shout out to Shadows Are Baggage. That needs to be the title of a movie or something. So this is probably the only one where I've actually combined two signs that I actually saw inside one another. Other than that, they're just what you see is what you get.
And even in this case, these were really together. Like you're not taking two signs and putting them together from two different places. So I think going to the idea of the show and what drew me to putting the three of you together in one show was that you're dealing with things that we see every day that we don't necessarily pay attention to, right? Abandoned signs, discard piles, and bottles, This is stuff we see all the time, and we just sort of take it for granted. And you guys have honed in on them in your own individual ways, which I think is super cool. Plus, I think they look great together. But I just wanted to highlight that. I thought that was a really neat way to do it. But I also think it's interesting that each one of you is representing what's there. You're not taking any liberties, right? You're not like, oh, I'm going to change the color of that tire, or oh, I'm going to put two signs together that aren't really there. I mean, Rebecca, you take a little more liberty because of your color choices in that direction you go with the colors. But still, you're creating the forms that are there, you know. So that's sort of, I really enjoy seeing these works together, and I really thank you guys for letting me put you guys together. So I'm going to open it up to a couple questions. Anybody? Questions?
I got a question for Jason. Is that really what Howard, what you saw?
Which one? The top
The top right.
Yeah, absolutely.
What existed?
Yeah, everything there was really there. Yeah, exactly like that. I actually
Beautiful pile.
Oh, thanks. I actually put this one off for a very long time. I photographed it a long time ago and painted it more recently because I always work in this 4x5 format, and it was this really long, skinny thing that didn't feel like it worked. But yeah, I went for it. Yeah. I love the sort of heaping, moundingness of it relative to other files. Yeah.
Would you talk a little, because you do work from a photograph, right?
Mm-hmm.
Would you talk a little bit about working from a photograph? Because I think there's an inclination where people think you're like cheating when you do that.
Mm-hmm.
But I know because I've worked from photographs often, and there's a process that goes on, a dialogue between yourself, the photograph, and the pile that you saw. So you know.
I think it opens up a lot more possibilities because you've captured a snapshot in time, and you don't have to worry about lighting changes or the time constraints of being in front of something. Most of these paintings take months and months at a time to do, and I can just return again and again to the screen to look at. And I also am a sucker for detail. I really obviously love detail, and so the photographs I can zoom way further in than my eye could ever see. I'm always working, zoomed in about 400% in photographs.
Yeah.
For Rebecca? So are these the signs or are these through the rear view?
They're the signs.
Okay, because that top one, I'm like, oh,
Yeah.
maybe that's through the rear view that
The mirror, yeah.
Right. Well, there are some, like Kanoko, is that how you say it? Or Kanoko. There are certain signs that are certain shapes, so it could have been one of those, or it could be something else.
Definitely comic book.
Okay. But there are certain shapes that they're iconic. They're related to.
and a follow-up question regarding the colors.
Mm-hmm.
Because I noticed that's your nail polish as well.
That might have been I did know what the paintings look like. Yeah. I do tend to wear clothes that go with the opening. Not the blue. I didn't go for the blues.
I did.
But so I have been working in. When this series started, I did more bold. There were some bright reds and some more bold colors, but as I've continued, I've kind of gone muted, and I think to a certain degree that's has to do with age and wear, and do you see it, don't you see it, kind of falling into the background. I did make a big change with the blue monochrome ones, trying to see if I could play with how the sky shows through. But I immediately ran away and did all neutral yellows. So I think I'm more a neutral. I know they're not neutral, but comparatively.
That was an interesting aspect that you mentioned about them being Conoco signs, that you sort of steer away from things that are too obviously of a brand, it seems like. Or you're seeking out one-off signs.
I think they're all fascinating. These ones, so as far as an icon, so this is one, but often it's 3 in a row: beer, wine, liquor, or beer, music,
Pool.
whatever. Yeah, they are usually the 3 advertisements on the side of a dive bar. I don't mind a good rectangle. It has to be divided in a really interesting way, but there are some really interesting shapes, like a Wendy's. I came across a Wendy's sign that once you take it out, it looks really different than what you imagine. It's not the shape you think it is. Or Sonic is, so it depends, I guess. I like them all.
I have a couple questions, actually. One for Rebecca and one for Jason. Because I've been following your work for a number of years, and I've noticed, Rebecca, from back when you were working with the crystals, that your work was like extremely precise and very careful, and it feels like I'm noticing some more human touch, especially with the graphite. Is there a story there? Or?
So, okay, I'm thinking about, Vermont Studio Center, that was the Goldschmidt series, which was very rigid and based on scientific illustrations. So I love that you think there's a human touch. Because often, I think, Troy, you get questions about, is it printed, is it, I know they're crazy, aren't they? They're wild. No.
Well, I mean, because I've seen that,
yeah.
and then I've seen that, like, the pencil is definitely, it's almost painterly in places.
Yeah. Well, signs have those weird wiggly wires and stuff too. So, which, for better or worse, I have to choose to include or not include. Yeah, sometimes I don't include as much of those details, but I do like the little, the bashed out signs, the little chunks that are left.
It's good. I appreciate it.
Well, I mean, I do want to say it from a gallerist point of view that I have seen, over the years, you being willing to let your hand show a little more, not in a negative way, right? You're still super precise with things, but willing to modify your graphite line so that there's a little more gradation in it, as opposed to just a consistent line that's across, so that you get a little more depth out of it. So maybe it's more you've just matured in how you use it, right? As opposed to just, I have to do this flat surface and this flat surface and this, right? But I can see where your question came from. Yeah.
Yeah, and it's kind of similar to my question for Jason, because I feel like with the discard paddles that they've almost becoming more real, like before they were almost more ghostly. And I wondered if I made that up, or if that did that actually happen.
I think, I have gotten much tighter and gotten more into the details, and I've updated my practice to be better about controlling my values and things like that. I've also upgraded my camera over the years and been able to zoom in more. Yeah, I've been happy with my craft development over the years. Yeah. It's just been natural.
So I'm going to wrap it up there, just for time's sake. But you guys, please stay and visit with the artists, ask them questions. That's why they're here.